What has already happened is a brazen act of aggression in violation of international law, in violation of the UN Charter, in violation of the Helsinki Final Act, in violation of the 1997 Ukraine-Russia basing agreement. Russia has engaged in a military act of aggression against another country.
There again, Secretary of State John Kerry. Want to let those comments sink in a little bit more. Russia, according to Kerry, has committed numerous violations by sending troops into Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula. Kerry also said that President Obama was, quote, considering all options before responding to rapidly escalating tensions in the region. This as the Ukraine mobilized troops in response to Russia's, quote, declaration of war on the region. Also, Kerry warned President Putin that he should carefully consider what Russia's real interests are in this situation. Hello and welcome back to America's Forum. I'm John Bachman. More on the crisis now in the Ukraine from Secretary of State John Kerry.
Russia may be able to invade Crimea, but in the end, Russia will isolate itself. There will be cost to the economy of Russia, cost to Russian businesses, cost to Russian individuals, and ultimately, I think Russia will isolate itself on a global stage that it just spent $60 billion through the Olympics to try to present a different face on.
Well, Britain and France's foreign ministers have said they are pulling out of planned preparatory talks for the upcoming G8 summit, which is also supposed to take place in Sochi. But Russian President Vladimir Putin stands by the move to send troops into Crimea, defying calls from the West to pull back. Putin insisting that Russia has a right to protect its interests in Crimea and throughout the Ukraine. Back with me now to discuss more of this, J.D. Hayworth and David Patton. Also, we're going to bring in Hannah Thobum. Hannah is from the Foreign Policy Initiative. Hannah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is an incredibly complex situation when you factor in the ethnic makeup of Crimea and the Ukraine as a whole. What can you tell us about the population of Crimea?
So unfortunately, the last census that was taken in Ukraine was in 2001. And in the Crimean Peninsula, we do think that things have changed somewhat since then. The original population of Crimea were Crimean Tatars, but they were expelled from Crimea in 1944 by Joseph Stalin. Since 1991, since the fall of the Soviet Union, many of them have started to return from their exile in Central Asia and Uzbekistan or places like that. So the number of Crimean Tatars that was in Crimea as of 2001 was about 12% of the population. Russians made up about 58%, ethnic Ukrainians made up another 12%, and then various other ethnicities, Belarusians, Greeks, Armenians, comprised the rest. That balance may have changed a little bit, but we do know that Russians are certainly the majority in Crimea.
Now, there are also these Tatars. There's reports that they're forming local militias in Crimea. Would this present any sort of obstacle to Putin at all?
An obstacle to Putin? No, I don't think so. From the Crimean Tatar perspective, they have had a rough history with Russia, and they do fear that being part of the Russian Federation will bring upon them the same sorts of things that happened to them in 1944. And they're very concerned, I think, now in forming these militias about simply defending themselves against any kind of ethnically motivated aggression that may come their way, though I would not expect it to.
All right, right now on the screen we have some file video of a recent protest in Crimea. That's the Russian flag there. These are pro-Russians in the Crimea region, but the Tatars, as you mentioned there, Hannah, have a long history, an adversarial history with the Russians. J.D. Hayworth, David Patton with us. Guys, when we look at these ethnic minorities in these regions, a complex situation. What would you like to ask Hannah about how the U.S. should approach the situation?
John, let me turn to Hannah on this because it's been said in our own American history that Alaska was Seward's folly, and that turned out to be wrong in terms of energy and what we now see in what is our 49th state. But does the Crimea become Putin's opportunity in terms of Soviet history? Correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, didn't Nikita Khrushchev in the post-Stalin era really cede Crimea from the Soviet Union to the Ukraine as a type of, for lack of a better term, gift? And with the ethnic majority of Russians, despite what international law says and what John Kerry stipulated in Sunday appearances, isn't there a historical basis? We may not agree with it, we may find it objectionable, But isn't that the method that Putin is employing now for his step forward into Crimea?
You know, it's really very complicated. Both Ukraine and Russia, of course, were part of the Soviet Union. And in 1954, Khrushchev had said ceded Crimea, and maybe not ceded is the right word, but he shifted administration of Crimea from the Russian SSR to the Ukrainian SSR. Russians have always said that, oh, he must have been drunk while he was doing it. Other people say that, no, he did it as a gesture to say to the Ukrainians that, you know, we remember how you've joined yourselves with us and we thank you, and this is something we want to give you. It's connected to you. And others, frankly, say that it was because Crimea was economically unsuccessful, and he wanted to get rid of it. Or not get rid of it, but get it out of the Russian SSR. So as to whether or not Putin has any basis for doing that, you know, it's very, in saying that he does have a basis to do it, it opens the door for many other problematic sorts of events. Groups of ethnic Russian speakers in Kazakhstan, ethnic Russian speakers in the Transnistria region of Moldova, it's a breakaway region. And by that standard, we would allow Putin to go in and take those regions as well.
And that was my next question is, you know, if Crimea is next, or Crimea has already happened, what then would be next? What follows if this is a slippery slope, as some people fear with Putin?
If there is something to be next, it would be eastern Ukraine. And that's a major if, but many people in Russia as well as Ukraine expect that that's a serious possibility. There's a significant Russian minority in regions of eastern Ukraine. And there have already been demonstrations, pro-Russian demonstrations, which Ukrainians say are, you know, orchestrated and organized by Russians that have been bussed in over the border. And there are pictures of buses with Russian license plates in those areas. But it's really just very unclear. There are people with pro-Russian sentiments in that area, and they do have a different mentality than do people in, say, Western Ukraine.
And Hannah, recently Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, she was talking about Vladimir Putin, and she seems to think that Putin has lost his grip on reality. Is that a sentiment held by other world leaders and, you know, Hollande in France and other places as well? Is that the consensus among Europeans?
I think it's an opinion that is based in our worldview, our Western worldview, and when Angela Merkel says something like that, yes, I mean, I think it basically means that it's impossible to reason with Putin at this point. But we have to remember that he has his own form of rationale. The one thing he's really been promoting in Russia over the past several years is that Russia is different than the West. He wants to promote a certain Russian, Eurasian worldview.
Well, Hannah, it's obviously this is a very complicated issue, and we got much more to talk about. We'll have you back in the near future, hopefully, to discuss this as things continue to escalate. Much more to come on America's Forum here. We're going to take a look at the issue of terrorism and our common enemies that we may share with Russia and Vladimir Putin, and what this could all mean as we get ready to celebrate the one-year anniversary, or mark, I should say, more appropriately, the one-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings. Tweet me your questions, your comments, your concerns.
What you don't know about Pope Francis will